Welcome everyone. These are the last video lectures of the semester as we wrap up the course. And what I want to do in these next two video lectures is go over the political and economic history of Latin America over the last several decades. And in this video lecture I'll focus on the economic history, and in the following lecture I'll focus on the political history of Latin America. Let's begin with the 1982 debt crisis. If you remember, Latin America's economic model in the mid-20th century was import substitution industrialization. And this was characterized by a strong role of the government in the economy, looking inward for economic development, and also economic nationalism. And during the 1950s, Latin America experienced some of its most dynamic economic growth. But the ISI model, import substitution industrialization, was going to run into problems in the 1980s, and it was going to be abandoned in the 1980s. And Latin America was going to adopt a new economic model called Neoliberalism, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. So let's focus here on how this transition comes about. And in particular, it was the 1982 debt crisis that is going to lead to the transition. And during the 1970s, Latin American governments began taking out foreign loans to finance economic growth. This had to do with very low interest rates that were available at the time, and also there was high oil prices. And this benefited oil exporters such as Mexico and Venezuela. And there was pretty dynamic economic growth during the 1970s, and these were actually good times for the middle class. And the governments as well, the bureaucracies of Latin America's governments grew, and they started to invest in big public projects as well. So Brazil was investing in big hydroelectricity dams, and Mexico, for example, this is when Cancun was built up in the 70s. So there was a lot of public works projects that governments were financing. And Latin America's economic growth became dependent on these foreign loans in the 1970s when interest rates were low. And as you can see, this second bullet point here, Latin America's external debt grew from $75 billion in 1975 to $315 billion in 1983. And that was okay as long as interest rates were low. But what happened in the early 1980s is that interest rates went up when oil prices collapsed in the early 1980s. And when that happened, the interest rates went up so much that Latin America could not make the payments on its debts. And the international banks refused to refinance these loans that had been given to Latin American governments since the 1970s. And this is what creates the crisis. Mexico is going to have about $100 billion of debt, as well as Brazil. So they made up a large portion of this total debt. And when that occurred, the payments on the interest were so high that Latin America was basically forced to default on these loans. They could not make the payments on the loans. And Mexico was the first country to default in 1982, and later it was followed by governments across the region. And this crisis that was caused by the debt, it was a protracted economic crisis, and it lasted throughout much of the 1980s. And this is why historians refer to the 1980s as Latin America's lost decade. And this is going to be the decade when import substitution, industrialization declines, and there's a search for another economic model. And it was the worst recession in half a century. Latin America's economy stagnated, and in some cases, the economy shrank. So for the entire region, there was only about 1% annual rise in GDP. And this happened to be, the population growth was actually growing faster than this during these years. So the economies were actually shrinking. And this led to high unemployment. Wages fell. In Mexico, wages fell by 50%. And there was also hyperinflation when the value of people's money just was basically worth nothing. And this was also the period when there was the growth in the informal economy. And the informal economy is like the black market. You know, when you see people on the streets selling goods or just selling food on the streets, right? It's not an official store that pays taxes. And bad thing about the informal economy is that there's no labor protections, there's little job security, no pensions, no police protection, and of course wages are low. And the informal economy has been a significant part of Latin America's economy ever since the 1980s, when it started to expand. And also, crime increased as a result of high unemployment, and this was when the drug trade really started to expand as well, particularly in Colombia in the 1980s. The drug war was at its height, and it would last through the 1990s. And of course, later in the last decade or so, Mexico has become the center of the drug trade. And as a result of governments having less money and less tax income, governments decreased social spending, so there was less spending on things like schools and healthcare clinics. And in general, these governments began to play a smaller role in the economy. And as a result of this crisis, Latin America was forced to reevaluate its economic model. ISI had failed. It had culminated in the debt crisis of the 1980s. And there was a search for an alternative, and that alternative was going to be promoted by Washington, D.C., and by international banks, and it was going to be called neoliberalism. So for the remainder of the lecture here, I want to define what neoliberalism is. And what neoliberalism was not economic nationalism. Economic nationalism had characterized Latin America's economic policies for much of the mid-20th century. And economic nationalism, where the government plays a strong role and these countries look inward for economic development and seek to assert control over their natural resources, those policies in the 1980s were blamed for the crisis. And with the decline of economic nationalism and nationalism in general in Latin America, we start to see the rise of globalization. So these neoliberal policies I'm going to discuss here are very much related to this idea of globalization beginning in the late 1980s and 1990s. And the International Monetary Fund agreed to refinance Latin America's debt, but only under certain conditions. And those were if governments agreed to implement austerity. So if they agreed to stop spending so much money. Also, if they agreed to privatize state assets. So all those companies that the governments had controlled in the mid-20th century, telecommunications, transportation, controlling natural resources, those companies were to be privatized and sold off to the highest bidder, to be auctioned off. And there were limits to this because many of the oil industries, which were very important to Latin American governments, they remained in the hands of Latin American states. So, for instance, Pemex in Mexico. But actually, even in Mexico, in the last few years, they started to privatize part of the state-owned oil company, Pemex. But in general, they were privatizing the state assets. Also, Latin America agreed to promote free trade. So instead of looking inward for economic development and depending less on the world economy, now Latin America is going to seek trade with foreign nations. So this was in many ways a return to the economic policies of the late 19th century and early 20th century. And that's partly why it's called neoliberalism, because it's based on the classic liberal economic policies that go back to Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations in the early 19th century. And there was a lot of faith that was, for example, put in the idea of the market and the invisible hand of the market, and how the market will regulate the economy, not state policies. And also Latin America agreed to implement monetary controls, so to stop printing so much money for political gains or for political purposes, and let the market regulate how much the value of your currency is worth, not to manipulate it just for political ends. And these reforms, they lead to deindustrialization. So Latin America economies become less dependent on industry now, and there was more dependency and growth of agricultural exports by the 1990s. And also, many labor unions had lost their power as well. Remember, labor unions had played a significant block of political support for politicians in the mid-20th century. But with deindustrialization becomes a decline in labor union power. And this transition to neoliberalism away from ISI, it was a very painful transition. This crisis lasted a long time, and it led to a lot of unemployment because a lot of people lost their government jobs as the governments began to downsize and play a smaller role in the economy. But on the positive end, it did lead to monetary stability. So inflation had always been a problem in Latin America for much of the mid-20th century, but with monetary controls came monetary stability. So the value of the currency was much more stable and wasn't fluctuating up and down as frequently as it had been before. And finally, by the 1990s, there was economic recovery. So the economy stabilized by the 1990s, and they began to grow, but only very slightly. And economic growth was still very modest in the 1990s, but nonetheless, it was stable. And kind of the final component of neoliberalism was the adoption of free trade policies. And Mexico was the first to pursue these, and other countries would as well. Mexico opened its economies to the U.S. trade and investment, beginning with the North American Free Trade Agreement, which went into effect in 1994. And this is NAFTA. And this was really a big change for Mexico because for much of the 20th century, it had shunned economic integration with the United States. And NAFTA is a trilateral trade agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, and it eliminated barriers to trade and investments. It made it easier for Mexico and the United States to trade with each other, and it made it easier for American corporations to invest in Mexico. And later, Latin America is going to pursue many of these free trade policies with the United States as well. But Mexico was the first. And kind of a good symbol that I always like to bring up in these courses about neoliberalism and free trade is, when you go to Latin America today, anywhere, you see in the main plazas, in the suburbs, in the downtowns, you see American corporations. So you see Starbucks, Walmart, Kentucky Fried Chicken, McDonald's, you see Lowe's, Home Depot, all these companies, which are American corporations, they had not been established and they had not done business in Latin America in the mid-20th century. And these free trade policies, such as NAFTA, it makes it easier for American corporations to do business and invest in Latin America. And so they start, American investment in the region starts to explode. And these economies become globalized, right? They're global companies are what are coming to dominate these economies, no longer, these nationalistic policies of the mid-20th century. So, you can use those policies or those companies as they're kind of symbols of globalization and neoliberalism. And NAFTA specifically, it created the largest trading bloc in the world. And the border between the United States and Mexico it's the busiest border in the United States in terms of economic activity that goes on back and forth between the two regions. So in the next video lecture, I will discuss the backlash to this transition to neoliberalism because, as I mentioned, it was a very painful transition and there were a lot of winners and losers, and it restructured Latin America's economies. And by the early 2000s, there were politicians who were going to be winning elections who promised to get rid of neoliberalism. So I'll talk about that in the next video lecture.